The following accounts are based on alleged eyewitness testimony and are presented for entertainment purposes only. These stories are submitted by actual viewers just like you. Therefore, all stories delivered in this video should be taken with a grain of salt. In 1988, a young man named Max was terrorized by an experience he could never forget. At the tender age of 15 or 16, he encountered something so frightening that even to this day, it still sends shivers down his very spine. Now, for years, he had shared his stories with others, believing it to be just a one-time occurrence, unique to his experience. But in May of 2020, he made a shocking discovery that his tale was not so uncommon after all, and that the same terror had been gripping people all around the world. You see, it all starts back in 1983, when the young man was just 10 years old and his family had just relocated from England to South Africa. They had settled in a rural area where there wasn't much to do, so the young man turned to reading to pass the time by and just to find something to enjoy. By around 11 or 12 years old, he had exhausted his own collection of books and began to delve into his mother's extensive library of all sorts of great books, like horror novels and the like, quickly becoming a massive fan of authors like Stephen King and Dean Koontz. Now, with time, he had read nearly every horror book in his mother's own collection. He was a judge a book by its cover kind of guy, so if a book didn't have an eye-catching cover, well, it wouldn't quite make his reading list. But as he had read most of his mother's books, he was running out of options. And that's when he stumbled upon a specific book. A book with a plain red cover called Apprenticed to Magic by W.E. Butler. Although the cover wasn't particularly interesting, the title is what piqued his curiosity, and having run out of books, he just decided, why not? Let's give it a chance. The book itself was about Western magic, and had promised to teach its reader many things, including the ability to astral travel. It's the idea of essentially leaving the body and visiting places in the spiritual realm without being seen or heard, and it sounded extremely appealing to this young man's adolescent mind. So he set about following the exercises in the book as he became more and more engrossed in its contents, more obsessed with what this book was trying to teach him. It's almost like he became so engrossed that this book had a hold on him. And he got deeply into the idea of meditation and getting his spirit in the right spot to do this. Now, while on the subject, he kept trying to get his mind into a meditative state where his body and everything were perfectly relaxed so he could astral travel. And he even shared this discovery of his with his friend Ruben, which was a buddy of his from school. And they even studied the book together. And his friend Ruben had got the magic bug where he was just as eager to learn the secrets and master the skill of astral travel. They both thought that, well, hey, if we both learn this and we both succeed, we can meet up somewhere and do whatever we want together without anybody else knowing. And so they devised a plan to meet up somewhere while floating around in the ether. However, after 2 weeks of trying to focus his own body being weightless and picturing waterfalls, he was getting nowhere and beginning to doubt the whole thing could even work. Now he was getting incredibly bored with the whole concept and idea and just decided to give up. And he even told Ruben that, you know what, I think this whole thing is just a bad joke. Let's just move on. Let's forget about it. Now, he cannot say for sure that this particular book had anything to do with what would occur next, but he believes there is a connection between it and what he was trying to achieve. The event that follows happened the exact same day that he informed Ruben that he was quitting and giving up this whole thing and that he thought this whole thing was just a joke. Now, his family had recently gone through a very tough time. His parents had split and his mom had moved to a new housing estate. Although it was nice, the houses were pretty much on top of each other. And that was the night when strange things began to happen. His bedroom was relatively small, but large enough for a single bed, a bookcase at the far end, a small table to the left of his bed, close to the window that his stereo system was on. I mean, it was fairly common for him to turn off the lights and plug in his headphones and just listen to cassette tapes while trying to drift off to sleep. I mean, as a teenage boy, also common for him to ensure his bedroom door was locked, right? As it was for the night in question. Now, on this very night, at about 2 a.m, he sits bolt upright in bed and instinctively pushed himself back so he was pressed against his pillow and the headboard. From the second he opens his eyes, he knew something terrible was about to happen. Although he had not seen or heard anything up to this point, he was suddenly overcome with such a feeling of dread and foreboding that he instantly breaks out into a cold sweat. The door to his room opened, and that is when he saw him. Not it, not her, him. He could make out no features or details because it was completely black, like a solid shadow. Even though the hall light was on and illuminated the far end of the room when he had entered, he could still not make out anything other than his silhouette. And he moved with impossible speed from the doorway around the bed until he was standing right where the stereo was next to the side of his bed. It was as if they were incorporeal to him, as he literally had to be standing in the same space that table and stereo occupied. Max was completely petrified, frozen to the spot, looking at his open door, too scared to even make a break for it. So Max just sat there, looking away but unable to face him. It's weird, but he could feel his coat brushing up against his ear. But the only way Max could describe the sensation was if it was made of solid air. And he could sense him, this unknown person or thing, looking down at him. Eventually, unable to do anything else, he just swore at him. I said, "Screw you, I'm not going to do anything. You will have to make the first move." And he said this over and over, but in reality, it was probably only about 2 or 3 times. This figure or being or entity, whatever it was, then turns, moves out the door with the door closing behind it. Now, he does not know for how long he sat there, but eventually he plucked up enough nerve to get out of bed and walk to his bedroom door. It was still locked. He would be lying if he told you that he could recall how long it took him to fall asleep. It could have been minutes, it could have been hours. He does not remember, but he does remember lying in bed feeling more scared than he had ever felt in his life. Now, years go by, and someone would ask him if he believed it could have been sleep paralysis. You know, the whole thing was a symptom of that phenomenon. And he doesn't think that for 2 very specific reasons. The first is because he moved the moment he woke up. I mean, he actually sat up, pushed himself against his headboard, and scanned the room before this mysterious figure had entered. Also, he had turned his head away from it when it was standing next to his bed. And I guess a third and final reason is for what he was about to learn at this day of school. So now the following day happens, and he gets on the school bus, and he starts to tell his friends, "Guys, I experienced something terrifying last night," and begins to go into vivid detail about what he had experienced. And Max was surprised. I mean, not only did they seem to believe his crazy story, but a few of his friends said that they too had strange experiences the night prior. Not so much seeing a shadow man or anything, but their dogs going mad about at the same time for no reason. I mean, Max is no fool. He knows kids will lie to get in on the story, because they want to be relevant. He doesn't exactly give credence to what they told him then or now, nor would he expect anybody listening to this to do so either. However, here's where the twist to the story comes in. However, when Max would see Ruben, he knew for sure that he had not imagined this whole thing. For you see, Ruben did not take the school bus as Max did. He used to get a lift with his mother. And Max knew this, so soon as he arrived, he went to the school gate to wait for him with his buddy Marcus. Now you have to remember that this was way before cell phones and the internet, so there was absolutely no way he could have known what Max had told people on the school bus that morning. Marcus, though, had been on the school bus and had told him everything. So while Max and Marcus were waiting, they were just chatting about what this whole thing could have been, which up to that point, nobody had any idea. While Ruben's mom pulled up, Max runs up to the car and could instantly tell something was wrong with Ruben. He seemed to be worried, seemed to be very visually upset by something. And so he figured maybe he had a fight with his mom or something had happened. Regardless, Max was more concerned at the time about what had happened to him. So the moment his mom pulled away, he opened up with, "You won't believe what happened to me last night." Now, before Max could continue saying anything, Ruben turns to him and says, "What happened to you? Forget that. You won't believe what happened to me. About 2 o'clock last night, my horse woke me up going absolutely mental in my room. It was wrecking the place. Then I looked over and saw a man in a long coat and hat standing by my door, looking at me through the glass. The guy was pitch black. As he saw me looking at me, he ran faster than anything and had completely vanished. Apparently, it took him ages to calm his horse down and even longer to fall asleep, which was why he was so tired looking and haggard." Quick side note here, Ruben's bedroom is a little bit different than Max's. His was huge, and he lived on a plot of land, and his bedroom was actually a converted workshop of some sort that was a little way away from the main house. One side of the room was entirely glass, and there was even a glass door that would be sometimes left open on warm nights. And his room was so large that it was not uncommon for his horse to sleep in a wide open part at the far end of the room. Crazy, right? Very, very strange. But anyway, after Ruben detailed his own story with what apparently sounds like the same entity, Marcus, standing next to both of them, was just like, "Dude, I can't believe you guys both saw the same guy." Ruben's face had dropped, and Max had told him what had happened to him if he did not believe him to go and speak to the dozen or so people who had heard Max talking about it on the bus that very morning. The only difference in Ruben and Max's descriptions was that Ruben's entity wore a flat hat rather than a top hat like the one Max had saw. Was it the same one that maybe did a wardrobe change between destinations, or two different but connected entities? Max does not know. But at this point, he wondered if who or what visited them because they were attempting to astral travel. They decided there and then to never read that book again, as both of them at the time felt that that was the only thing, the book, connecting them and these entities to everything else. And at that point in time, that was the first and last time either of them ever saw this thing. And for more than 30 years, that event, although still very creepy, had been reduced to nothing more than a scary tale to share when the occasion called for it. That was until May of last year. Suffering from the lockdown blues, Max decided to flick through obscure documentaries on Amazon Prime. And he searched for a while until he came across a documentary called The Hat Man. And the moment he clicked on the description, his blood ran cold. There, detailed in the synopsis, was precisely what he had seen as a teenager. Now, he watched the documentary with apprehension, and the more he watched, the more he could not believe what he was seeing. Hundreds, if not thousands of people all around the world have seen this same entity that him and Ruben had seen all those years ago. In 1988, when Jay was only around 9 years old, he was spending his time, like most other children during this era, at a summer camp up in California, high up in the Sierra Nevada mountains. Now, one day, himself and 2 other boys decided to go out on a rowboat with their camp counselor. And they were having a blast, a great time at this camp. It was beautiful weather, the sun was shining, they were all enjoying each other's company, the lake they were on was serene and peaceful and quiet, and they were just excited to get to go on this boat to learn more about nature. And more importantly, they were having a blast learning how to operate the rowboat. Imagine being a young boy or young girl and just being so excited and thrilled to experience nature for what felt like the first time for a lot of these young boys. Each of them getting a chance to take a turn and learn. Now, if you've never been on a rowboat, especially as a young child, it's pretty exciting. Now, one of the boys had asked the counselor, looking around, "Hey, can we go across the lake over there where all those huge cedar trees are?" And so the counselor was like, "Yeah, sure, that'd be a great idea." And so he agreed, and they all started to head towards the other side of the lake. Now this is where things start to take a turn. Now, the counselor and the three boys, they finally make it to the other side of the lake. Probably no more than a few minutes, maybe a little bit more of a row. And right now, they decide to dock the boat because the counselor is like, "You know what? I really got to go use the restroom right now, so just please don't leave the boat. Stay right here. I'm going to be right back. Do not leave the boat. For any reason, don't." And so he gets out, making sure the boys are calm. They understand what's going on. He goes off right into the tree line and begins to do his business. So they're all having a pretty good time waiting for their counselor to get back, and they're sitting there chit-chatting, enjoying the beautiful scenery of the lake. And a couple of the boys reach down into the water. They're grabbing rocks and they're chucking it across the water, and they're laughing and joking. And Jay even makes a mental note, and he can remember vividly just how thick the forest was around them. In fact, it was so thick, the canopy and the foliage, that the trees were almost blocking out the very sun, as it was kind of dark around there. And in that moment of a 9-year-old realizing this, he begins feeling a little scared, just kind of looking around, being like, "Okay, this is fun, but all right." And in that very second, as he made that observation, all three boys are alerted to something, screaming and shouting in terror and pain. Immediately, they turn to respond to this, and what they were hearing was their counselor. Their counselor was screaming and screaming, and they could hear him not only screaming but running. It sounded as if he was in pain, tremendous pain. And instantly, almost instantly, they see him break through the tree line, screaming, a terrified look on his face. Within a split second, out of reaction to what was happening, the boys kind of jump back in the boat, as if they really had not really gone far off the boat, but they jump back in, not sure what's going on. And running closely behind this counselor was what all three boys would describe as some unknown creature, some unknown animal, this bipedal wolf-looking thing that was chasing the counselor. And within seconds, this thing actually tackles and grabs onto the counselor, and they both flop down into the water, only about 3 feet away from where the boat and the boys are. And the boys are stunned. They don't know how to interpret what's going on. But whatever this thing was, it was humongous. Jay could vividly remember that this thing was probably 10 or 11 feet tall. Massive, right? Just a massive animal. They maybe thought it was a bear or some kind, and were not really sure why it was chasing the counselor on 2 legs. But as they were seeing this scene unfold in front of them, this thing was thrashing their counselor around and moving him in the water, and they did not see him, but they could hear him screaming as he's being taken in and out of the water, as this thing is doing whatever it is to him. And this large, unidentified creature was so engrossed and thrashing around in the water with the counselor that it didn't even take notice or care that these young, very vulnerable boys were nearly 3 feet away at most. And so the boys, completely fear-stricken, just started to row the boat away from the scene as fast as they could. At this point, they figured their counselor was dead. They could not hear him screaming in pain anymore, and they're rowing further and further away, and more distance is being created between them and this animal. And this thing is not stopping. It's still thrashing his body under the water, and these boys are completely traumatized. And as they're getting further and further away, they see this thing pick up the counselor's body and drag it back into the tree line. Now they're scrambling, and they get back to the camp, and they're hysterical. They're running, they're screaming, they're crying, they're asking for help. Immediately, the attention of all the counselors, or remaining counselors, come over. They start asking the boys what's wrong, and these boys are crying, they're sobbing, they're hysterical, they're telling them everything that had happened. And the words they said was, "A werewolf had killed our counselor." Now, obviously, the staff were like, okay, hold on. Maybe the boys saw something here. Maybe there's a bear attack. The authorities, because of the severity of the situation, were called in, and the sheriff had arrived. Search and rescue had arrived. A man in a suit arrived, taking each of the 3 boys and began asking them and questioning them about what had happened. Now, the man had never informed Jay and these other boys his name, but he only informed these boys that he was a good guy. And he asked the boys to describe in full detail what the animal looked like, what the animal sounded like, and you could imagine the terror and fear and trauma these 3 young 8-9-year-old boys experienced, and that they were probably incapable of giving accurate descriptions or functioning as anybody could. Now, they told him that they didn't hear this thing make any sound once it was attacking the counselor. And this was all while the search and rescue were scouring on that side of the lake, seeing if they could find a body, or if he was still alive, find him. And for the remainder of his time at that summer camp, he was terrified and would not speak for almost 3 months. I don't know why the camp actually continued to operate after that. You think having something that severe, they would have shut it down, but you know what? I wasn't there, so I don't know all the details. But Jay's parents took him to several doctors right after, and to no effect, he did not say a single word to anybody about this until a little than a year later. Now, when his mother had asked Jay to tell her what had happened, he just lied to her and told her that there was a very large bear that broke into the cabin while at camp. Jay's mom seemed relatively satisfied with the answer and never brought the topic up again. But to this day, Jay has never said anything about what he saw that day while at that summer camp. Now, going back for a second, back to when this unidentified man in a suit, who could have been a detective, Secret Service, we're not sure, when he was questioning the boys, he didn't even tell the boys that it was a bear that had killed the man. He left the camp while the rangers and sheriff were still searching for the counselor, or what was left of him. But at the end of questioning, he gave all 3 boys firm instructions to do one single thing: to never tell a single soul about what happened that very day. Many, many years ago, when Martin was around 16 years of age, he lived with his extended family in Tijuana. And because there was so much family living in one place, there was actually too many kids for casual entertainment, like hanging around the house, playing games. And so a lot of their time was actually spent outside, exploring, just rendezvousing, getting into debauchery of all sorts. And so it was very common that his older siblings used to take several of the other younger siblings out on all these grand adventures. And the adventure that would take place this very day happened about 9 miles out towards the Presa Rodriguez, or the Tijuana Dam. Now, as children, they loved this idea. And it didn't even matter that they had to walk 9 miles, because there was fishing involved, and they loved fishing at that river. Not to mention the adventure of actually getting out there just seemed so thrilling to Martin and his 4 other younger siblings. And so they all gathered together, they loved the idea, and they started off on their trek towards that dam that morning. And so on the way there, the oldest sibling was sharing these amazing adventure stories with all 4 of his younger siblings, just getting them really hyped up and really pumped up and excited, and they just could not contain their love for nature. And they would go all through the mountains, and this was back at a time when there actually weren't too many people around here. There weren't a lot of houses, there was barely anything. It was a lot more quiet and even scarier, far more desolate than it is nowadays. So, long story short, they went to fish and swim at the bottom of the dam. So they finally make their way out there. They're having a blast, they're swimming, they're fishing, they're just having the time of their life. Now, as you and I could probably both imagine, that walking 9 miles, no matter if you're 9 years old or 19 years old, it's going to take a considerable amount of time. At least, a couple hours, maybe 2 or 3? I'm not exactly sure, but definitely a good amount of time. And so already, between that and then them spending a good chunk of time out there, it had already begun to grow dark without any of them noticing. Now, as the sun is just starting to crest the horizon and the light is starting to dim, The oldest sibling, whom Martin never named, decided to whistle at them to say, hey guys, we gotta go ahead and get ready to go back home. It's getting dark and we need to be back home before bedtime. Completely disappointed and all bummed out, all the other siblings are like, oh man, we gotta go. So they get the fish and stuff they caught, they get all dressed, they're getting ready to go, and they start to move as a group back towards the road, which leads all the way back home, when they see a group of teenagers running in their direction who seem incredibly frightened. And this group of teenagers actually runs past them like they're running from something. And in that very moment, all 5 of them hear what they describe as a loud flapping of wings. Thinking that there was some large bird following them, they had also recalled hearing a screech when those teenagers ran past them. The oldest sibling, Martin's oldest brother, figured that there was potentially danger. So Martin's older brother, having done these kinds of situations before, he decided to do a quick drill in case of danger. He placed all siblings back to back so they can practically have a 360-degree view around them, just trying to see what exactly was going on. And he also carried a pistol on him for protection and pretty much for the same reason. Now, as they were pretty much all back to back, they noticed that the night around them was eerily quiet. I mean, it was dead silent. And they noticed in that silence, there was a chitter chatter sort of sound and more flapping. And so Martin decides to look over in the direction that this noise was coming from, over a large rock, and he saw what he describes as a being there around 7 to 9 feet tall, that it looked like a statue, but kind of like a giant eagle, but with a man's body. And of course, this is in the darker lighting, so he's not getting all the details just yet. And he now kneels and seeing this thing and whispers to his brother. And they could all see that this thing had smelt them and began screeching again in response, flapping its wings. And then all 5 of them hear a gunshot. But it wasn't Martin's older brother that shot the gun. He didn't even have his pistol out yet. It was actually the teenagers that had passed them that were sitting between the rocks. Now, the younger kids at this point were so frightened and overcome with fear, they began to cry, turning away and starting to run. Now, at this point, this thing began to come into view more, and it was such a view that Martin claims his blood turned to ice. He describes the eyes of this entity looked interested and hateful toward a bunch of these kids. The wings were probably twice its height and had a very devilish bat look to them. Now, Martin goes into detail about the lighting, that it's dark, but it's just enough light that the sun is just cresting a bit to reflect the top of the mountains. And that's when Martin truly gets a good look at its face in detail and describes it being like half human, half demon, but kind of like a mix of a bat and a person. And that the eyes glared this time in red and a brightness he has never seen on any animal either. Now, a second shot in that moment was heard. By this time, they were beginning to regroup to start climbing up to the main road because they're terrified. They want to get away from whatever this thing is that they don't know. Now, as they're clambering back up to the main road, this mysterious man just appears out of nowhere and he's beckoning them to come towards them. Come on, come on. It's also evident that this man who's beckoning to them is armed. And so really, between these 5 teenagers, they really don't have a choice. Either go towards this bat thing or run to this armed man. And they decided to take their chances, running to the only thing they could perceive as protection. So when they get to him, they're terrified and he's telling them, look, don't ever look that thing in the eye, explaining to them that you're safe now, I'll get you out of here. And Martin describes feeling a wave of safety come over them as they're like, you know what? Everything's going to be okay. This guy's going to take care of us. We're going to get out of here. He seems very well educated. He seems like a good guy. And he's now commanding them to get in the back of his truck to climb under there. You'll be safe. Go. And as he's commanding these 5 young teenagers into the back of his truck, the other teenagers who they saw earlier are now jumping in the back of the truck with them because they're scared. They don't know what to do. And he's just yelling, go, 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 get back there now. I got this. And he aims his rifle up again at this bat thing and begins shooting more and more. Now, as all 5 siblings climb into the back, They noticed that the truck had iron bars all around the truck's bed. They're all terrified, unsure of what's going on or who this guy is, and then now hear him running. He jumps in the truck, slams the door, turns the truck on, and he yells back to them, "I'm gonna get you guys home pronto. This thing has now smelt us. It already knows where we are. And it's not going to stop until it takes somebody." And bam, this truck is now flying down the road, and as this truck is hauling butt down the road, they hear those wings again. And it's getting closer, and it's getting closer, and now shortly it's almost right over the truck, and it sounds pissed. And it's making this horrendous screeching noise that reminds Martin of like a demon or something. Martin was convinced that this was a living, breathing gargoyle, and it starts swooping down trying to attack the truck, trying to tip it over so it can get to the contents in the back, the now 7 teenagers that are now in there. And as this thing is swooping down trying to tip the truck over, they all begin to smell its odor, this putrid smell of rotting flesh and sulfur. And multiple times as this thing would dive down and try to grab onto the bed of the truck that was securely covered by these thick iron bars, they were looking up and seeing that as this thing had sharp talons, very large talons by the way, that reminded Martin of like a rooster. Very exaggerated sharp claws, just trying to rip and grab onto the iron to rip it open. It appeared extremely aggressive, very vicious and angry that it could not get to what it wanted, which was one of these 7 teenagers in the back of this truck. All the teenagers in the back were able to cover themselves with this large tarp he had back there, but Martin was just so in awe and terror at what he was seeing that he was mostly uncovered, watching everything going on. And he would go into detail describing how its wings looked, as if there were these large, nasty bat wings that had ripples in them, and when it would dive down and try to rip open the iron bars, he could hear these wet bone popping sounds, and he would go into detail about how horrid its face and body looked and how exaggerated and terrifying its fangs and teeth looked, and he was convinced that what he was seeing was something out of the pits of hell. And this would go on and on until they got to the lighted part of Tijuana, where it eventually gave up and flew back towards the dam. Now, the tarp that was covering the teenagers wasn't actually tarp, but military wool blankets, very thick, perfect for hiding. So when the truck eventually stopped in a very secure and safe spot where they can all get out, he told all these teenagers very closely that he was a retired military operative and he would train every single day, and that his entire life mission was to kill this thing. And in fact, he actually hangs around the dam every single day to try and wait to see it so he could take it down, because he does not want to see one of these things grab one of these young kids. He also informed these teenagers that he was actually American and had been following this abomination of a creature for about 3 years ago. He had actually followed this thing to the Tijuana Dam because he just listened and paid attention to the rumors that there was supposedly sightings of a big winged monster that the police never took seriously. They blew it off. They didn't want to talk about it. And so with a desire to take this thing down, he decided to start hunting it for revenge. Now, the man told these teenagers that they were very lucky that nothing had happened, because he had done this before, where he had rescued teenagers or kids or people in the area nearly being attacked by this thing and threw them in the convoy and took off. Now, apparently, there were some people who got lost on the road before. They were either swooped up by this thing, never to be seen again, or God only knows what else. All he knew was that this thing had actually lived by the dam somewhere, hiding by the structure in the daytime and coming out once the sun sets to attack and feed. And that sometimes he could even see it patrolling the road looking for any prey to grab. He even claimed that he saw that it had offspring at one point, but he shot them down. The man then took all these teenagers to a tiny restaurant in the city, speaking to them in perfect Spanish, by the way, begging these teenagers that if they're ever going to go back to the dam ever, please only ever go there during the daytime. And once you see it start to get dark and the sun begins to set, leave now. Do not waste any time. But if they do, look for him because he's around. And it was during their dinner meal that he revealed his name to all of these teenagers, that his name was Mark. And so once they were done having dinner and they were calm and at least secure for the time being, he took them all back in his truck and took them each to their houses, dropping them off one by one. Now, as it turns out, Mark actually gave his phone number to Martin's oldest brother. And as it turns out, Martin's oldest brother would actually do yard work and housework for him for well over 2 years until Mark decided to permanently go back to the US for some treatment. And as time would go on, Martin himself figured that it's best to leave Tijuana behind and permanently move to the United States. But that's not right where our story ends, for you see, there is a twist. The reason that Mark was wanting to take revenge on this thing, the reason he had dedicated so much of his time and training to taking this thing out and protecting others around the area, something I had not mentioned till now, is that allegedly this thing had killed his daughter and his father. It had taken his daughter, who was 14 and was found on a road by San Diego County, dismembered. And the authorities said it was a person that did this to his little baby. But the authorities simply blew him off and told him that it was clearly somebody who did this, not something. Now, his father, at one point, Mark's father, began hunting it as well. And apparently, at some point, this thing actually attacked his father. He survived, and its talons must have done significant damage because his father passed in a nearby clinic. These were his sole reasons and drive for completely focusing in and wanting to rid this entire Tijuana Dam area of whatever this was. Now, as far as Martin is concerned, whatever they encountered that night is still there around the Tijuana Dam, and he highly encourages anybody who hears this to not go there at night. If you guys enjoyed today's stories, smack that like and subscribe button for all things mysterious and supernatural. And if you don't, well, that thing will get you. I love you all, keep an open mind, and I'll see you guys in the next video.